for businesses. In fact, in 2006, Clive Humbly, who we may know and some of us may not know, was a British mathematician who coined a phrase that you've probably heard before, that data is the new oil. And he really talks about the availability of both resources because neither oil nor data is valuable in its raw state. Rather, value is really derived when it's gathered rapidly, when it's gathered completely, when it's gathered accurately, and it's connected to other relevant data. And here we are 18 years later in 2024. And this continues to hold true. Content is the lifeblood of any organization. It carries the activities, the interaction, and the transactions of business. In fact, with Microsoft 365, we see over 2 billion documents enter our service every single day. To put that into perspective, that is over 83 million documents an hour that enter Microsoft 365. So it holds very true that content is not only the lifeblood of every organization, but it's the lifeblood of every app. And businesses around the world are managing more and more data than ever. It's part of every core business process. So if you think about building apps to manage these documents, it's complicated, it's time consuming, it's expensive, and it takes significant time from solving actual business problems. SharePoint Embedded was created to solve these problems. So I'd like to turn it over to Reed to tell you a little bit more.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bill. I really appreciate the quick introduction. So my name is Reed Carlberg. I am a product manager on the OneDrive SharePoint team, and you've just been listening to the dulcet tones of Bill Baer, who is my PMM counterpart here. And what we do is we talk a lot about what SharePoint Embedded is, introduce people to it, help people understand how they can use it in their apps. By way of getting to know us just a little bit more, I always like to ask people a fun question about their background. And the one that I like most is, what was your first concert? I find it very telling. And so you are totally welcome to judge me on my answer. My answer was Motley Crue, the Theater of Pain tour at the Rochester War Memorial, very long time ago. Bill, what was your first concert that you remember as being seminal, as being, very formative for you?
Oh, my first concert was Nirvana, pre-Bleach.
Nice.
Well before their Sub Pop deal. Saw them in Europe. It was a great show in a very small venue. So that one always sticks out to me.
Awesome.
Obviously, I'm much cooler than you.
Yeah. Well, it is funny. We were talking about this ahead of time, and I think you can judge both of us based on the concerts that we attended very early on. But one of the things that I'd like you to think about is, as you're listening to us talk about SharePoint Embedded and you're starting to understand how this new technology works, is think about in your company, your enterprise. So whether you are a company that builds software for other people or you're a large enterprise that's managing software internally, how many places do you have files and documents? How many systems do you have that manage a significant number of files and documents? Now, Bill is monitoring the chat, so if you want to, type some things in there, you can go ahead and do that, and we can talk a little bit about that as we go on. But, the really interesting thing here is that when you start to talk to enterprises all over the world, they have a very common problem, and that's that files and documents are literally everywhere. They might be stored in a line of business app. They might be stored in a third-party built ISV app. It could be something to do with finance, or it could be something to do with sales. But you have these files and documents spread across many, many systems in the typical enterprise. And that's a real challenge. It's a real challenge from a management standpoint. You have different interfaces. You have different capabilities. And that drives up, actually, the administrative overhead of managing these writ large. And so we started to really ask ourselves an important question, which is, how might we help that? As Bill said, M365 gets well over 2 billion new documents every single day. And we have a very consistent, well-recognized admin functionality that helps IT teams everywhere trust M365, know that when they need to do, for example, e-discovery or other compliance work, they have those capabilities built in. And so you can imagine a world where we have a unified content platform that every system uses when they are managing files and documents as part of any app. And that's where SharePoint Embedded comes in. So SharePoint Embedded is an API-only headless version of SharePoint for apps. Now, you might know a little bit about SharePoint Online, or you might know a lot about SharePoint Online. It's a very powerful system. It's been around for a long time. But SharePoint Embedded takes the best of SharePoint Online, and it gives you a dedicated stack, a dedicated space within your M365 tenant, or if you're an ISV, it gives you that space within your customer's M365 tenant, so that you can manage files and documents using the trusted services of Microsoft 365. And so this might be M365 collaboration, security, compliance. It might be the administrative capabilities as part of the SharePoint Admin Center or one of the other admin centers that's there. And the really exciting thing is that all of the information that you store within SharePoint Embedded is now Microsoft 365 Copilot ready. So if you are an M365 Copilot subscriber, all the files and documents that you store in these dedicated SharePoint embedded partitions that we just talked about, these are now actually available to the M365 Copilot experience. It's also possible to build custom Copilot experiences, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. Now, very importantly, SharePoint Embedded is all on metered consumptive APIs powered by Graph. So it's separate from any Microsoft 365 entitlements you, or again, if you're an ISV, your customers might have. Now, this is actually a very powerful opportunity for an ISV because you get a dedicated area, a dedicated stack of API calls and other resources, for example, which means it's easier for you to manage your customer's experience with your app over time. So again, we'll talk some more about that once we get a little bit deeper into it. But I want to end with this, is that SharePoint Embedded also includes all of the M365 business continuity promises that you and your customers have come to know and love. So I will take a pause here and just let you know that SharePoint Embedded is now generally available. It's generally available worldwide in commercial tenants, and we have GCC tenant capability coming soon, sometime in H2 of this year. We have a great 2-minute explainer video on this, so if you want to hit that QR code with your phone, you can go over to the announcement, and you should feel free to share this around. You know, if you're trying to educate some of the people in your company about what SharePoint Embedded is, this 2-minute video is a great way to start. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about how SharePoint Embedded fits into the rest of Microsoft 365. Now, one of the things that you might already know is that we have a number of new apps that are out there that are doing really interesting things. We have Microsoft Loop, which is a new way of collaborating on content. We have Microsoft Designer, which is a new way of creating images and attractive things for publication. And then, of course, we have things like Microsoft Edge Spaces. All of those are actually powered by SharePoint Embedded. So under the hood, they are using SharePoint Embedded to manage all the files and documents that are part of those services. What's awesome about this is if you are building enterprise line of business apps, or you are building an ISV app that you want to sell to global enterprises, you can be confident that you're using the exact same stack. Not like the same stack, not similar to the same stack. It's literally the exact same stack to manage files and documents for whatever app it is that you're building. And of course, it's built on top of M365 security and compliance and deeply integrated with the Microsoft Cloud. Now, this gives you a ton of features, and I'm not going to read everything that's on this slide. You want to think about 4 C's that this really gives you, right? So it gives you all the compliance and security. It gives you all the collaboration with Word, Excel, and PowerPoint that you're used to. It's Copilot ready, so you get M365 Copilot experiences if you're a subscriber, and you can build custom Copilot experience that's happening. And again, I'll talk more about that later. And of course, then you have all the core storage capabilities, which again include those M365 business continuity promises. And so if we take a little bit of a deeper dive into that, I want to talk first about collaboration. One of the reasons that people come to us when they say, hey, we need to start working on files and documents is collaboration. They want a better experience for all of their users when it comes to working on Word documents or Excel files or PowerPoint presentations. And with SharePoint Embedded, that's actually very easy. So, of course, everything is all API, but as part of that API, you get one handy URL, and I'll show you how this works in a demo here in a second, but you get one handy URL, and you can redirect a browser to that, and suddenly you're in the Word web client or the Excel web client. And from there, or if your customers have it configured to open the desktop client, it can also go directly into the desktop client. And it is a full-featured collaboration experience. You have your @mentions, you have presence indicators, you have everything that you need to make sure that you're doing any type of conflict resolution in terms of different edits. So all the features that you've come to know and love as part of Microsoft Office are now available as part of any file and document that you're managing with SharePoint Embedded. Now, we could also go deep into the security and compliance section. And the way to think about this is that if you are building an app and you want to make sure that app takes advantage of purview capabilities, for example, or things having to do with the M3 or M5 license levels that E3 or E5 license levels that you might have. SharePoint Embedded makes that possible. So right out of the box, you have the ability to do e-discovery. You have a unified audit log. You are able to do things around bring your own key and encryption. It's an extremely powerful system. And so when you build this into your app, you actually get to surface those M365 superpowers as part of your core value proposition, which is great. So I want to talk a little bit about the innovation that makes all of this possible, because it's a really interesting thing that we've been able to do. So if you think about a typical Microsoft 365 tenant, it looks a little bit like this, right? So you have a tenant boundary, and within that boundary, an IT admin has configured it to behave a certain way, configured a certain number of compliance policies, etc. Running across the whole thing, you have this very powerful M365 storage platform. And so this is where, as Bill was talking about earlier, customers are typically uploading more than 2 billion documents every single day. Already today, we have the ability to use that same storage platform across multiple partitions. And so in this example, you can see where we have SharePoint and OneDrive. There are existing partitions within this customer's M365 tenant. And what we're introducing is the ability to create a custom partition for whatever app it is that you're building. And so this SharePoint embedded partition, it lives in the exact same M365 storage layer that you're used to. And so that's how it includes all of these capabilities that I was just talking about. Now, in addition to this SharePoint embedded partition, you want to start thinking about this new file and document management primitive that we call SharePoint Embedded Containers. SharePoint Embedded Containers are a very lightweight way of managing a very high volume of documents. So these are a highly scalable construct. The default limit is 100,000 per app per tenant. And so you could imagine that if you're an ISV and you're selling to some large organizations all around the world, for example, this is a very high scale way of managing a lot of files and documents. Now, the app that you're building, and this is true whether it's an ISV app or a internally delivered line of business app, the app has full control over its containers. So the app can instantiate a new container. The app can apply permissions to the new container. The app can go ahead and garbage collect a container. All of this is possible from the app. Now, containers is a highly overloaded term, but what you want to think about it in this context is that it's a way of mapping your business process onto your file and document management needs. And so you want to take a look at what your business is and then start to say, this is probably what our information architecture should look like. So a good example of this, we have a couple of examples that we see on a pretty regular basis. One would be a consulting project. And maybe this consulting project is a tax consulting or it's an audit consulting or something else. But this consulting project can be very easily a customer identifier, and maybe that's a customer name or a customer ID, whatever makes sense, followed by a year, right? And so when you do that, then you could put all of the files and documents related to that customer, related to that year, into this container and manage it as a discrete unit. Another one that you might think about is in the legal use case. We've talked to a lot of law firms about this, and the way that they typically think about it is a legal matter. And so a legal matter is a little bit more granular, a little bit more discrete unit of tracking information. But when I say granular and discrete, you should not confuse that as not having very many documents. If you've been through a legal process, you know there are typically a lot of documents involved. And SharePoint Embedded is designed to make it easy for you to manage all of that. Now, I talked about the fact that you can have a lot of these. And when I talk about this 100,000 per app per tenant, you need to know that that's a soft limit. So if you have something where you say, hey, this looks like it would work, but we actually need 200,000 or 300,000, we want to talk to you. This 100,000 is kind of the limit where we're comfortable with you architecting whatever, and it's going to be totally fine. Once you get it over that, we want to have a conversation with you and really understand what it is that you're doing to make sure that you're architecting it in a way to match how we're built. Now, the security boundary on this is a really important part. If you have been in the SharePoint Online world for any amount of time, you know that SharePoint Online has a very robust permissioning system, and that permissioning system can also cause some inheritance where you might suddenly say, okay, here's a person who needs to access this thing, and someplace down in the document libraries in there, that inheritance very logically flows through. The security boundaries on SharePoint Embedded are different. So SharePoint Embedded containers have no access to them unless you add a person to it. And we'll talk a little bit more about what some of these roles are here in a second. But the way to think about them is that if I have access to a container and Bill has not been specifically added to that container, Bill has no access. Obviously, vice versa would hold true as well. Now, you can add those permissions either at the container level itself, or you can also add them further down in the file and document tree within that container. And so, for example, you might say, Bill owns this container, but Reed now has access to this folder within that container. And that's a perfectly valid configuration, and it's very easy to manage within the system. Oh, okay, good. So now this is my favorite part. We get to go into a demo. Before I do that, Bill, are there any questions that we should be pausing on and talking through it all, or should I just get going into the demo?
Yeah, I think we have a couple. So,
Okay.
And they're interrelated. So before you hop into the demo,
Sure.
Two questions when we talk about data ingestion. You mentioned that SharePoint Embedded is Microsoft 365 Copilot ready. One of the questions from the audience today is, does this also mean that the content is reasoned over by our semantic index for Copilot?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So when you think about how a document comes into M365, it has a very well-defined pattern. Somebody goes ahead and saves it either to SharePoint or OneDrive. It goes into both a lexical index and a semantic index. And then with the advent of Copilot, it also gets ingested into a vector database. Now, SharePoint Embedded is in that same storage layer, and it goes through that exact same process. And so when you think about saving a document into a SharePoint Embedded container, it gets brought into the lexical index, it gets brought into the semantic index, and of course, it gets ingested into the vector database. The key thing here is that this is also all security aware. So I was giving the example before how Bill might have access to a container that I don't have access to. So let's say that he saves the document into a container and it comes into the lexical index, the vector database, etc. When Bill goes to search for it, he's going to find it because he has access. When I go to search for it, I won't find it because it's security trimmed and very security and identity aware. So I won't be able to find any of that information or use in Copilot any of that information that I don't have access to. So Bill, that was kind of a long answer to the question, but I hope I got to it.
Yeah, that's perfect. And let's go ahead and do one more before you hop into the demo, and then I'll throw some more at you here in a moment. But kind of continuing on the topic of ingestion, another great question that came through in the chat is, can content be ingested with graph connectors?
So this is a great question. This is a separate system from how you would bring in graph connectors. So graph connectors, and Bill, jump in here if I have this wrong in any way, by the way. Graph connectors are a way to get data into the main M365 Copilot semantic index so that you can do all sorts of great LLM stuff with them. Now, graph connectors are a separate product from where SharePoint Embedded comes in. So you do use Microsoft Graph to get data into SharePoint Embedded, but it's a different technology than the way that we're doing graph connectors today.
Yeah. Yeah, and graph connector data obviously can participate in semantic index, but graph connector is all about metadata ingestion. It's finding those important pieces of information that kind of surround an envelope and bringing those into the graph so we can reason over them with Microsoft Search, and then you can do creative things with that data. You can also build apps against it. But as Reed mentioned, the patterns are more or less uniquely different here. I'm going to go ahead and hold on to a few more of these questions so we can check out your awesome demo.
Okay, great. So for everybody on the call, you are going to notice that this is not a marketing produced demo. This is actually my handy little demo account, and I'm a developer that is way more comfortable kind of on back-end services than I'm on front-end UXs. So we're going to start here, and I want to show you the SharePoint Admin Center. So the SharePoint Admin Center is where typically IT admins go to manage content at scale. And so you'll see we have this notion of sites, and of course SharePoint Online has sites. And SharePoint Embedded is all about this new thing that you see down here, containers, over on the left. Now, I said before that lots of Microsoft products are using SharePoint Embedded to manage various files and documents. And so here you can see that there's a couple of Loop containers, right? So we have this application just called Loop. And so Microsoft Loop actually creates a container every time you create a new workspace, and that's how it manages files and documents. Now, mine is actually this extremely marketing-friendly ZDM V6. That's my app name here. And we'll go over to an app that I have running just on my local host. And I'm going to log out first so that you can see it. We'll log in. And when I do that, it's going to prompt me for an account. And now I can go in and I can start to do things like list containers. Now, I said before that containers are the primitives where files and documents are managed as part of SharePoint Embedded. And you can see right here, this demo 2024-611, that's today. And so I went ahead and added that this morning. And here we are. You can see it right in here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and create a new container. And I'm going to call this one Bill Loves Nirvana. You're welcome, Bill. And then we'll hit submit. It'll take just a second while it goes ahead and creates this container. Now, if you are somebody who comes from the SharePoint Online world, you might be thinking about, creating a site and a document library and a site collection and all that is a fairly heavyweight operation. And if you're thinking that, you're correct. It is a fairly heavyweight operation. But one of the things that we've done with SharePoint Embedded is we've really optimized this for app use. And so you can see that what we just did was a very lightweight operation. It went ahead and created this container very quickly in the background. And if I go over here to the SharePoint Admin Center and I just hit refresh, you'll see that this is now reflected in my list of containers. So here's Bill Loves Nirvana right there. So I'll just go back over to the app. And I'm going to click into this container. Now, the user experience of a SharePoint embedded app is entirely up to the app developer. So I've created a very basic user experience just to facilitate me demoing this. And I'm going to start by uploading something. So I'll choose a file. And I have a bunch of sample files here that are kind of fun. And I'm going to choose the impact. I'm going to choose understanding canine behavior. That's always a fun one. And we'll upload the file. And once we upload the file, you'll see that I now have a list of files that I can do various things with. I said before that this gives us a simple URL that we can now essentially use to open up the Word editor. So I'm just going to click on Edit right here. And you'll see what happens is it opens up a new tab on my browser. Up the web Word client in edit mode. And so here we are, and we have a full-featured Word editor that we can use. right? And if we want to from here, we can even go ahead and open up in the desktop app. Now, the desktop app actually gives us a few different things. I got to tell you, I'm not sure what's up in my desktop app right now. So we're gonna go in adventure mode and we're gonna see what happens. It's gonna open this up, and I'm gonna have to pull my Word document over here from someplace, but here it is. You can see that we now have the full-featured desktop client that is helping us, and it even has this hello, which I typed in there before just a second ago. Now, there's a few really awesome things in here that I want to show you that are very SharePoint embedded unique. And so I'm going to start up here at this understanding canine behavior. So a key portion of SharePoint embedded is the ability to use security and compliance features. One of the most important security and compliance features is sensitivity labeling for a document. And so in here you can see that I have the name and I have a little document library that says where we are, right? So this is my crazy little org name, this 1129A dev. And then we have the sensitivity labeling. And so from here, we can start to go ahead and apply different sensitivity labels to this, which means it's going to behave in different ways depending upon what type of client we use. It'll be different as far as searching based on what kind of permissions we have. And so I'm going to go ahead and just say that this one is confidential for all employees. Oh, because others are editing this document. See, it's right there. Hang on. Let me close out my web client. There we go. We'll go in here. And we'll go back to confidential, and we'll change it to all employees. Okay, well, it'll take a second before it registers that this is not there, but I can show you where this has already been applied. But you get the idea. You have the ability to go ahead and actually change the sensitivity labels in the Word client or Excel client or PowerPoint client while you're doing it. Now, importantly, if you go in here to containers, and I'm just going to list all the containers that are in here. There's a few that I think are actually worth kind of taking a look at from a different type of file. So for example, if you are sharing and managing PowerPoints, you can click on that. That actually downloads it. Sorry, I forgot my user experience. I got to click on edit. And here we go. Now we're in PowerPoint and we're actually editing this PowerPoint file that Copilot created for me. I'll go ahead and get out of there. And we have the sample invoice, and I'll go ahead and preview the sample invoice. And you can see that it brings up this sample invoice PDF for us as well. Now, I bring up the PDF because I want to land on a very important point here. SharePoint Embedded is designed to facilitate collaboration with Word, Excel, and PowerPoint in a very seamless way. But it actually works with every file type. You can put any file type in here that you might imagine. And so in this case, I used a PDF. You can actually use something that we have called the One-Up Viewer to deliver the preview experience for more than 300 file types. So if you have videos, if it's a medical application and you have DICOM images, or maybe it's an engineering application and you have CAD/CAM files that you want to be able to preview, we support more than 300 file types, and you have instant access to the preview capability as part of that. That's just built into the SharePoint Embedded system. Now, there's a few other things that we can do here. If I go back over here, I believe that my high school students, no, that's not it. Here, I keep clicking on that. I got to change my user experience. Okay, so you'll notice this one comes up and says, sorry, we can't open this one for editing in a browser because it's protected by information rights management. So this one I marked as confidential earlier, and that means that we can only open it in the desktop app. And so I'll click on open it in the desktop app, and it'll take just a second, but here we go. So everybody who's on the phone, if you have teenagers in your house, you might notice a theme in terms of of these sample documents. I have a teenager in my house, and so I'm thinking of all kinds of documents related to him for my sample work. But you get the idea, right? It's a good illustration of how all this comes together. I'll go ahead and close this, and I'll close out my preview of the sample this, and I'll close out this. I'm going to come back here, and I'm just going to show you search, because search is actually very interesting. And I'm just going to type in Japan. There's a few things about Japan in here, and you can see that if you do that, it gives you the regular search results that you would expect. I'm going to go ahead and just click on that, and of course, when you click on that, it again brings it open into edit mode. You can also configure it to bring it open into preview mode. So there's a quick demo. There's lots more that I could show you, but those are the basics. And with that, Bill, I'm just going to ask you: is there anything else that we should take a look at before we go? Did you have any questions from the audience about what we should dive more deeply into?
Yeah, we actually had quite a few. So
Oh, okay,
I'm going to
great.
go ahead. I'm going to go ahead grab about 5 of these questions that recently popped up. So earlier you talked about loop workspace and a container is created with each loop workspace. One of the
Yeah.
questions from one of our viewers is, does loop also have a 100K limit?
A 100K limit of containers. So remember what I said before, is that our default limit out of the box is 100K containers per app per tenant. Now, that is a soft limit. We have already had ISVs and some large customers tell us that they need more than that per tenant. And so Loop does not have the same restriction around 100,000 containers per app per tenant. We've gone ahead and raised them up. We've worked very closely with the Loop team along with the designer team to make sure that that will be fine for them. Now, from a tenant standpoint, this is transparent to you. So if you're an IT administrator and you're thinking about how do I get that approved so I can have as many containers as I want, you don't have to worry about it. All that happens in the background. From SharePoint Embedded's perspective, it's interesting. We are peers. We work a lot with the M365 teams that build on top of SharePoint Embedded. But from the SharePoint Embedded team standpoint, we actually consider them just another ISV app, right? We work with them in the same way. They have the same type of interaction and the same type of documents that we have for all of our other great ISV partners.
Awesome. Great answer. And thank you for that, Reed. Let's go ahead and tackle a few more.
Sure.
Another question is, would it be possible to exclude a container from Semantic Index or Copilot?
Yes. This is a fantastic question. I'm so glad for whoever asked it. You can see I get a little Lloyd Lindsay Young here, very excited about it. But the way that this works is, for an app, you have this glue in there, right? That's really important because you have a definition over in Azure of what an app is, and then you have all these containers, and you need something in the middle which ties those together and defines how those containers work. And we call that a container type. So the container type simply strongly types those containers so that they behave a certain way. And you can, at the container type level, say, exclude from lexical index, exclude from Copilot experiences, exclude from this, that, and the other thing. There's a bunch of options on there. And our mission is to make this very flexible for app developers. So that if you're an app developer, again, LOB or ISV, because we've seen this on both, and you have questions about how the data is going to be used as part of these various experiences, you have a lot of flexibility about how you configure it. And all that's actually documented. And if you go over to this handy URL that you can see kind of at the top of my little demo app, that's where all this documentation is, and you can read a ton about it. I'll show this URL again later. What else we got, Bill?
That's awesome. Yeah, let's try a few more. So you showed us a couple of great examples. We've obviously learned a little bit about canine behavior and a few other things today. So that was compelling.
It's important.
But what if my users aren't licensed for Microsoft 365? What if I want to deliver this experience to users outside of my organization that may or may not have Microsoft 365 entitlements?
Sure. So this is a great question. So I'm going to take it from 2 different angles, right? Angle number 1 is first, when you use SharePoint Embedded, and you're an ISV, right? So I'm going to take it from the ISV standpoint first. When you're using SharePoint Embedded and you're an ISV, your customers have to have an M365 tenant with one SharePoint license in order to store files and documents within it. Now, chances are, if collaboration and security and compliance and Copilot and all the core storage capability, if that's important to your customers, chances are good they already have one, but I don't want to take it for granted, right? So they have to have a SharePoint license in an M365 tenant, and then you can store the files and documents inside a SharePoint embedded container. When you're an ISV, the data is always in your customer's M365 tenant. That's a core part of how this works. So let's say, though, that you are an enterprise IT department building a line of business app, and you want to actually share some of the documents that are stored within a SharePoint embedded container with different people outside of your organization. There's a lot of ways that you can configure that. It's actually very flexible. So you can configure it so that it's easy for you to share with B2B guests, for example. So maybe you have somebody configured as a guest user within your M365, super easy to share. Maybe you want to share it with somebody who is an anonymous user, and you want to send them a preview link. There's the ability to create a view-only link that you could send out to an anonymous user. In any case, however you decide to do the sharing, the actual usage of SharePoint Embedded is separate from any M365 licensing you have. Mm-hmm. And we're able to do that because it's a metered system. And so they do not have to have an M365 license, but they do need to be, configured in some way. And the more closely you configure them to M365, like an M365 B2B guest user, for example, the more high quality the collaboration experience, as an example, is going to be for them.
Yeah, that's great.
Anything you want to add on that one, Bill? I know you've spent some time in there. Did I cover it pretty well from your point of view?
No, I think you covered it. I think you covered it pretty well. And the last point was the one that's really salient: the fact that for full fidelity, you want to configure them exactly as you mentioned. It'll definitely create a better experience. So I'm going to throw two more at you. One can be a simple yes or no in the interest of time. The other one might require some explanation, but. Does SharePoint Embedded expose APIs that can be leveraged by migration partners, as an example? So we've got a great set of migration partners that help facilitate bringing data into our service. Do we have a set of APIs that are exposed to them so they can very similarly bring data into a SharePoint Embedded app or container?
Okay, so I never run into yes or no questions, so I don't know if this is what you imagined was a yes or no question.
This isn't the yes or no.
Okay, so in this particular one, the way that Microsoft SharePoint Embedded works is it uses the Microsoft Graph APIs. Now, there are a number of migration-specific APIs that are part of, I think we internally call them Vroom. Externally, I'm not sure what the name is. Part of I think that's the REST API family. Our mission is to put everything on Graph. Having said that, we've run into some circumstances where on a customer by customer basis, we have opened up these Vroom APIs so that there are some of the migration capabilities that are part of those APIs can be used with SharePoint Embedded. We had to do this, for example, with Microsoft Designer. Worked just fine.
Perfect. And last question before we move on, because I know you have a lot more to share and show for this particular segment. But one of the questions is you did a great demonstration of a very document-centric workflow, bringing a document into a container, leveraging the one-up viewer, showing how it can open up in the rich client, applying labels. What about SharePoint lists? Can you create lists inside of an embedded app?
No.
That was the yes or no question. So.
So there's some details as to why, and we have time to go a little bit into this in case you're interested. But when we were designing SharePoint Embedded, what we really wanted to do was make sure it was optimized for fast performance, using APIs, and be something that can be the back end for apps and manage all the files and documents. And so there's some things that we decided we weren't going to do. One of those is lists. And if you're on the call and you're not familiar with lists, lists are a kind of a lightweight database-esque way of managing, columns and fields and rows and all that kind of good stuff. Very popular in SharePoint Online and very useful, but something that in an app world you would probably replace with like a SQL Server or some other like Cosmos DB or something else. The other thing that we took away that I think is useful to talk about here is in the SharePoint Online world, you have this ability to create a very dynamic sharing tree where everything is additive. But someplace in there, you can start to put in subtractive permissions. So like I grant Bill access at the very top of a file and document tree. And then at some sub branch of that tree, I could say, Bill can't access this folder. Now, as you might imagine, that increases the complexity of managing those permissions exponentially. It is extraordinarily challenging. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not a use case for it. There is a use case for it. But what we've decided to do in SharePoint Embedded is that we only use additive permissions. And we've done that, in service of making this a very high performance system. So that's, another example of things that we don't do. There might be more that we could talk through, but if you have questions about that, feel free to throw them in the chat. So, okay, with that, I'm going to go back to the presentation. Does that sound right, Bill?
That sounds perfect. While you switch back to the presentation, I'll just answer this last one. One of the questions was whether or not embedded apps will consume from the total tenant storage. And no, the embedded app is separate from your total tenant storage.
Yeah, this is a critical thing. Like if you take away just a couple of things from this presentation, number one, I want you to take away the fact that SharePoint Embedded helps you deliver M365 superpowers as part. Number two, I want you to take away that it's separate from any existing M365 entitlements and governor limits that you might have. And so it really does deliver a app-focused experience where the app developer can be in control of their environment. It's a huge requirement when you're building apps, especially at scale, dealing with a large number of users and a large number of pieces of data. So with that, I'll go in here. We've been talking about this notion of apps having their own set of containers. And I think you've gathered this probably by now, but I want to make sure it's really clear that apps have their own set of containers. So my demo app has no access into Microsoft Loop containers. Microsoft Loop has no access into my demo app containers. The way that these are configured is these are all logically isolated from one another. Now, if you're an advanced developer out there and you're starting to think about, well, what about microservice architectures and, where I have a whole bunch of different executables that are discrete, but they might need access to that universal document layer, that is configurable. There are API calls that actually make that relatively easy to do. So you can go ahead and say, app 1 and app 2 can share a stack, but the default behavior is that they are isolated from each other. Now, I've talked a lot about ISVs. I really want to make sure that everybody who is an ISV on this call has this clear picture in their mind. So an ISV develops an app in whatever their development environment is. They push it to production through whatever stages they have, and then they start working with customers. In all cases, if you're an ISV, you are managing files and documents inside your customer's M365 tenant. And so you can see in this image, we have this notion where the ISV tenant over here on the left does this container type definition. You remember before when I was talking about the glue between an app and the containers? That's container type, right? They register those container types on each one of these customer tenants. So you can see I have 3 customer tenants on the right-hand side. And once they do that, they now have all the permissions granted by the customer to work with just those containers. So this ISV doesn't gain any extra access. It doesn't have any extra permissions that it doesn't need. It has just the permissions it needs to work with those file and document containers in the customer tenants. Now, I talked a little bit about the M365 experience integration. There's a lot that goes on with this. I just simply showed you, the sensitivity labeling and some of the ways that you can put the app name in here. So, for example, there's this app name and then container name. You got to see a little bit of that. There's more than that. Of course, there's the co-authoring and collaboration. You have the app branding, which I just showed you. You have various M365 discovery capabilities. So I didn't demo it today, but if you were to go through M365 search, you can actually search for any of the files that are in those containers within SharePoint Embedded. And if you have access to those files, the search system will surface them. Now, it's the same type of security trimming that you expect throughout the rest of M365 is exactly the same to that. So if you're used to being able to find files or not find files, depending on your security settings, you'll get what I mean. Now, there's also this extremely configurable sharing option. So we talked a little bit, Bill, about what it was like to share with external users.
Yeah.
If you're out there and you're thinking about, well, how do I make this easy for customers? There's actually a huge configuration opportunity on this one. And a customer might have an app configured so that it can share, or they might configure the app so that it can't share. And both those are valid. And so you can work with your customers to figure out what the right level of sharing is. But from a customer point of view, the most critical thing about this data is that the customer stays in control of their data. And that's one of the things that SharePoint Embedded allows them to do. So if we think about Purview integration, I've talked a little bit about this. On the left, we have this kind of example of what e-discovery looks like. And so if you've never had to do e-discovery, congratulations. E-discovery, we make it as easy as it can be, but it's still a pain in the butt. But with this one, you actually do have the ability to search across everything. So e-discovery out of the gate searches across OneDrive and SharePoint and email and Teams. And now what it does is it does those 4 things plus SharePoint embedded containers. And so it's designed to go through and be able to surface all of the information related to an e-discovery legal hold type query. And it's integrated automatically with SharePoint Embedded. The middle one here is audit. Audit's an extremely powerful capability that shows what users are doing what with what files. And so you have the ability now to have this unified audit stream. It doesn't actually display the files, right? It simply shows you that a user did something with a file so that if you need to go back and audit and see what happened, you have all the tools at your disposal to do that. And then the last one, of course, is sensitivity labels, which we've talked a little bit about. Now, Purview is a very rich family of security and compliance products. And so if you are using DLP or bring your own key or some of the other stuff down here like retention policy or multi-geo, all of that stuff is available to data that's stored in SharePoint embedded containers. Now, Copilot. I said that I would talk a little bit more about this, and we've touched on it in a couple of interesting ways. The thing that you need to know is that SharePoint Embedded is part of the Copilot subsystems, right? And so when you bring a document into SharePoint Embedded, it gets into the lexical index, it gets into the semantic index, it then gets into the vector database. And so if you're an M365 capital C Copilot subscriber, you have the ability to use Copilot to act on documents you have access to within SharePoint Embedded. Now, over here on this lower left of the slide, one of the things that you see is this notion of custom copilots, and you'll see that that's little c. So we start to talk about those as little c copilots versus custom copilots. And we're actually opening up a private preview for some really exciting custom Copilot capabilities. And so if you see this HR Smart application over here on the left-hand side, you'll see that it has a number of features, fairly standard, but then on the right-hand side, it has this virtual assistant. So what we're doing is we're delivering this Copilot chat widget so that you can actually surface it pre-wired into the Copilot system and working with files and documents inside SharePoint embedded containers. And so you can see already that it has this notion of find a candidate, create a job description. These are just prompts, right? And so when you think about the app that you're building, this is a way for you to quickly and easily build Copilot capability into whatever app that is. If you're interested in this, I'll give you a URL here in a minute or an email address that you can actually reach out to us and we can talk more about. So I said this earlier, and I really want you to take away some core information here. And when you think about SharePoint Embedded, it's these 4 C's that it gives you, right? Compliance, collaboration, Copilot, and core storage. And it does this all for apps, all within your M365 tenant. And really the mission here is, making it very easy to work and manage files and documents at scale so that you can focus on solving whatever your actual business problem is, and you don't have to worry about a file and document management roadmap. And trust us, we've been doing this for 20 years. It's an unending roadmap when you start to take into account all the global requirements and all the details that your various enterprise customers might throw at you. With SharePoint Embedded, you get all of that stuff out of the box at the end of an API. Now, before we wrap up, there's a couple of things that I want to make sure you get a chance to see. And that is some of the permission models. So we have this OAuth scope that's really important. And so when you are working on an app, when you are working on an app, you get to be able to say, this app can only use this type of container, right? How I was talking about all the containers being logically separated. I was talking about the various things that you might configure on a container within that container type ID. So this file storage container.selected is how you make sure that your app can do everything it needs to within its family of containers and nothing else. So you don't have to do any wide open permissions across the M365 estate in order to make this work. It's very narrow. We have both the notion of app-only authentication as well as app plus user or delegated authentication. There are reasons that you would use app, and there are some use cases where we recommend it. But most of the time, we recommend that you use app plus user. That's very consistent with what we do here at Microsoft. It gives you the finest granularity around things like audit controls and security permissions. And it also makes it very easy to do collaboration. Collaboration is functionally impossible if you don't know who the user is. And so app plus user is typically what we recommend. Now, there is a bunch of other information that we can talk about as we want to go deep into various OAuth scopes. But for right now, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to containers. So you want to think about these containers as being discrete security units, right? So you have at the container level 4 roles. You have owner, manager, reader, and writer. And you can put an Entra principal ID into those. So it can be Bill at Microsoft.com, or it could be Reed at Microsoft.com, or it could be a group that's in there, right? So you have lots of flexibility about how you add people. You also have the ability to go ahead and add people at a file or folder level someplace down in the container. And like I said, those are additive permissions. And so if you add Bill to a folder deep within a container, he now has access to everything underneath that folder. And so anyway, that's a high-level view of permission models, and we have lots of information on this if you're interested in taking a deeper dive. Everything is linked into our enterprise manageability set of features. And so if you like using SharePoint PowerShell, you can do that. If you like the SharePoint Admin Center, which is what I showed during my demo, you can use that. If you like the Graph API, you can use that. So you have lots of options and capabilities there. Now, we did just implement a new role, and this is something which we had customers ask us for. And the idea is that you could assign somebody to be a SharePoint embedded admin for just a particular container type, right? For just a particular app that uses SharePoint embedded. And that's now possible. So if you need to have somebody have admin rights on a very narrow scope, you can do that too. This is all done using Azure billing systems. And so if you're used to working with Azure and you're used to, working with subscriptions and resource groups and all of that, that's exactly how SharePoint Embedded works. So you can go in as either an enterprise or as an ISV and get this all configured. Now on the ISV front, there's a lot of knobs to turn in there. So if you're interested in taking a deep dive on that, you should reach out to us and we can go pretty deep with you. Couple ways to get started. I already showed this start SPE URL as part of my demo, and so that exists. I'm going to leave this screen up here, by the way, while we finish out any other questions. But if you want to go and read all the Microsoft Learn documentation, we have a ton of information up there. We have some sample apps and tutorials. There's a VS Code plugin that makes some of this stuff kind of a one-click operation if you're interested in doing that. We have free trial types so that you can actually try this whole system for free if that's something which is important to you. Now, if you are interested in joining kind of our enablement program, you should reach out. Send us an email at sharepointembedded@microsoft.com, and myself and the other members of the adoption team will engage with you to understand more what you're up to, and we can see which one of these enablement opportunities might be right for you. Now, if you're somebody who is part of a large organization, you have a mission critical app, and you want to get involved in this in a deep and material way, contact your account team and have them reach out to us about a early access program. We have people who are dedicated to focusing on some of the most mission critical apps our largest customers are building. And the right way to do that is to connect via your account team first. And with that, I think we're done. Bill, that's the end of the deck. How are we doing on questions? What else do we have to talk about today?
Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions. We've been answering them as we move along. So we've already tackled the question around SharePoint lists inside of embedded, as well as the APIs that are exposed to migration partners, which again are the Vroom APIs. I'll respond to that one with a link to what those actually are, given that that's an internal name that we use, but you can definitely take advantage of those as well. Some of the questions are from a migration perspective. Since we talked about APIs being exposed to partners, are there means delivered by Microsoft to help customers or ISVs move content into a container?
So there are ways to do that. We do have some of these APIs that are part of, I think it's called the REST API system is the public name for it. And so we can talk about those. The best thing to do on this one is to actually reach out to us and have a conversation about what your unique needs are, because it may be that the Microsoft Graph APIs are exactly what you need. But it's hard to answer that question before we kind of dive into some of the details. So this is a great use case for reaching out to us at SharePoint Embedded at Microsoft.com.
Great, thank you, Reed. Let's wrap up with two more before we conclude with 4 minutes remaining in the conversation today. So, two questions. With SharePoint Embedded Apps, am I subject to the same throttling as SharePoint Online?
So, this is one of the core things that I want you to take away from this presentation about SharePoint Embedded. So, remember how we talked about partitions, and SharePoint Online is a partition, OneDrive is a partition, and SharePoint Embedded lets you create your own partition. The notion of your API resource consumption really is what throttling comes into, right? Is that if you're on SharePoint Online, you have a particular allocation, and there's a very well-known and published formula that talks about this, of the number of API calls that you can make, and you have to build your app accordingly. Some mission-critical apps have a very hard time fitting within the limits that their organizations have. So when you're working in SharePoint Embedded, you actually have your own set of API governor limits that help you kind of manage how your app is delivered. And if you go over to the Start SPE, you'll see that we actually have limits published in there, and they talk about how this works. We have not had a customer hit those so far. Our mission is to create something which is very app friendly and also works within the metered resource usage. And so I would be very surprised if you ran into it. I've been surprised before by many things, so maybe you will. But in general, you have a very high limit of APIs that should help you work, be easy to work within as you're designing your app.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and wrap up on a high note. Reed and I will continue to answer your questions throughout the course of the day and throughout the course of the week that surfaced as part of your comments in respect to this webinar. But to end on a high note, one of the great questions here was, what if I just want to do some experimentation? Is there a trial or no cost opportunity available for me so I can just spin up an app and do some experimentation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you need. So number one, you have to have an M365 environment. And so if you have an M365 developer program environment, or you have something like a business basic that you're working with that has, a SharePoint license in it, or you have something in between, like we have this thing that we call a CDX environment that our partners work with, or maybe you have an M365 sandbox. Anyway, there's a lot of options in there is my point. As long as you have one of those, it's very easy for you to use a VS Code plugin to go ahead and create a trial container type, which is free. It gives you a lightweight version, including sample apps that you can now work with and start to understand how SharePoint Embedded works. This is also a great example of where the enablement program comes in. So we talk about this kind of thing on a regular basis. And so if you're interested in learning more, drop us a note at SharePoint at Microsoft.com, and we can tell you about some of these options.
Awesome. Thanks, Reed. And thanks to everybody who spent time with us today for this webinar and for your great questions. Again, we'll continue to answer those throughout the course of the day and throughout the course of the week. As Reed mentioned, you can kind of self-service get started at aka.ms/start-SPE for SharePoint Embedded. Again, if you're interested in the enablement program, definitely send a mail to SharePointEmbedded@Microsoft.com. And then if you're looking for our early access program information, which is more around deep engagements for defined projects, definitely reach out to your account team. We're at the top of the hour. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today, and we hope to see you again soon at another one of our SharePoint Embedded webinars.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bill.